plenty of questions for you guys. I would like to start by asking each of you to introduce yourself and just say a little bit about what you're doing at said company.
Sure. I'm Vince Neal. I look after data and technology for Essence. We're a media agency, but we're a data-driven media agency. And what I look after specifically is everything from ad tech, architecture, implementation to data strategy, which is leveraging the assets, data assets on behalf of our clients. Also things like BI, data engineering, and product.
Thanks, Vince.
Hello, everyone. Narayan Murthy, NM. I manage all things revenue and business at InMobi, Southeast Asia.
Hey guys, Vid here. I look after global ad tech and media platforms at Coke. Pleasure to be here.
Hi guys, I'm Vice President of the ad tech division at Sigma Software, which is a software engineering company helping technology partners in ad tech to help brands and publishers to survive right now.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I suppose a bit similarly to one of Lindsay's panels earlier on today, we've got quite a range of sort of backgrounds and specialisms on this panel. So we're going to be reaching into all sorts of different areas under the topic of contextual. I wanted to kick off with understanding from each of you whether you feel that contextual will become the default option in the world of marketing and advertising. We've spent the morning talking about significant changes to the industry. We've focused a lot on the value of data and the importance of first-party data. Do you think we are at a position where, as Caroline really emphasised in her presentation, contextual advertising isn't new. So do you feel that we're in a position now in the industry where this might become a default option for brands and marketers? Vince, shall we start with you?
Sure. I don't think default is necessarily the right word. I think, in the industry, provocative title notwithstanding, we always like to kind of find these moments, right? It's the year of XYZ. Right now, obviously, contextual is in the spotlight, and for good reason. Also, I don't think it should have ever taken a backseat to audience targeting personally. But at the end of the day, it's one of many tools in a toolbox of a marketer, and there's going to be times where contextual advertising is the better tactic, and there's still going to be times where non-contextual solutions are great. So, like, very extreme example, if you're a luxury goods marketer, you're probably going to want to be on a very premium space contextually. If you're a DTC, that's probably not the play you want to do. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I'll say is that for contextual targeting, it's not necessarily like a binary, it's either contextual or it's not contextual, right? I think a lot of times where the most success we've seen is when we're combining different forms. So a very basic example is if we're leveraging our audience first-party data, we're not using it for addressability, but we're using it to mine insights about the audience and using that to inform contextual buys, right? So a very basic example of it not necessarily always being like it's one or the other.
Yeah, that's an interesting point of view. Olga, you were going to jump in on this?
Yeah, I wanted to, first of all, support that it's not just something, to be default, but rather to be very effective in this domain, you have to be utilizing a mix of available tools. And the core of it is that audience targeting is not going anyway. The way you do it, and it's ID-based, is disappearing. But the primary goal for everyone, it will be to reach the right audience. And I think that because it's about cookies and we are thinking about it as a web context and the context of the web pages. But if we try to step a little bit away from that and look at the word context, what is context? Context is, it can be related to one same person, but if this person is in different environment, the context is changing. So I would encourage everyone and publishers and marketers to look at context as a wider notion, because you might be looking for the same person and you might address different marketing goals to the same person through different contexts. And I think the powerful role right now would be not only in web, but also in video advertising, in TV, in OTT, and in audio as well, because this is also evolving. And if you look at the lifestyle that we have right now, are you actually sitting, reading all day? You're either in the car, picking kids from school, you're listening and listening. So we need to be looking at context as more like what lifestyle we currently have and be very creative in terms of that.
Some really good points there. I'm quite sure Narayan and Vid, you've got some points of view on this. Maybe Narayan, from you first. I know you'll have a lot to say about a mobile environment.
Yeah, exactly. And before that, even It's very funny we talk about context in this world. And I was telling that I talked about context when I started advertising or digital in that sense. And again, we are in 2022, we are still talking context. Fundamentally, I don't think you can take away context from advertising because that's one of the facets of reaching out and advertising to anything and anybody. A small anecdote that I used to sell vacuum cleaners for pocket money in my college. The first thing I was taught that when you go and see a house before the door knock, you would see the context. You would see what car is parked outside, what kind of house it is, what kind of neighborhood are you, what kind of what kind of neighborhood in terms of the area, how big is the house. That's context. Based on that, you would be told whether you would actually knock the door and sell or even pitch for a vacuum cleaner. Context is never ever going to go away from what we do in advertising. Whatever you might do and whatever, I mean, that's why it was funny to see that it's resurgence of context. Context never went anywhere. We just termed it in a different sense. Context will always be there because that is how human nature, that is how the human beings decipher whether to take an action or not to take an action because of the context. And all the elements of what Vince and Olga are talking about are the same facets. We try to overcomplicate sometimes. That's probably our job.
How unusual for ad tech.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, context is always there and always going to be there, come what may.
Vid.
Sure. Taking a lead from there, context has never gone anywhere, right? One of the things that we've noticed is, that being said, we do see an increasing trend towards adopting more of the contextual marketing, pieces across all of our plans. This kind of started with all of the privacy concerns from GDPR onwards, right? I think the whole fact is today, privacy is not a choice. It has to be, in the DNA of how we do things, not just as a company, not just as an advertiser, as an ecosystem itself, right? Is it going to be harder for us to get to the right kind of audience and the right kind of manners? Yes, probably, but it's going to be worth it, right? I think that's probably the biggest evolution that we are seeing. So we are having a very dedicated focus towards getting more of contextual into our arsenal and actually executing upon them. There's a lot of shiny objects, that's all great, but I think what's already working needs to be given a lot of credit, and that's something that we are taking cues as well, right? So since then.
Yeah, really interesting. I'm tempted to dive into a question about data, but we've had a lot of data, so I'm going to actually just change gears for a minute. We'll come back to some of this. Let's talk for a moment then about creativity in a contextual environment. So we had a really interesting discussion earlier on today about creative transformation and the degree to which data, technology and creativity are merging. And we talked a lot about the value of creative tools in modern day marketing and how they can improve the ability to do really good contextual advertising. I'd like to understand where everybody feels that is at in the industry. So perhaps let's start with the agency point of view, because this has got to be part of your day-to-day to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, it's super important, right? I mean, if we go back to first principles, media, ad tech, everything we do in that realm, they're force amplifiers for good creative and messaging, right? So the primordial force is the creative, and I'd argue that in some instances, creative is more important for contextual strategies and tactics than it was for audience tactics, right? Because really what you're doing, there's two things that are happening when you're using contextual. One is, and this is something that folks have already talked about, but the first thing is you're trying to capture like people, quote unquote, in the moment, intent, whatever you want to call it, but there's a time element to it. There's a temporal element to us, one. And the second thing is there's an element of the synergy between the creative itself and then the environment in which it's placed. But because of that, I think it's even more important to have strong, right-sized creative when you're doing a contextual tactic, because it's more important in terms of maximizing your odds for it to drive impact.
And do you feel that we're a lot further along that path than we were a few years ago? What kind of tools are available to help that from a sort of technology and execution point of view? Yeah,
I would say so. I think a few years ago, what we were doing is, we were leveraging public APIs to, extract context out of the environment. Things like, Maps APIs, weather APIs, and you're trying to use that to inform the creative to make it more contextually relevant. But those are not very scalable in the sense that there are individual executions, right? Whereas now there's a lot more technology companies that are leveraging, whether it's natural language processing, sentiment analysis, vision AI, and CTV, ACR, of course. And a lot of those are a lot more scalable. So in terms of scalable automated solutions, there's a lot more of that that's existing, but also developing now than maybe like 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah. Vid, I'm just interested in your point of view from a brand perspective. Do you feel confident about some of the sort of creative tools that are available to make your contextual campaigns really sing?
It's one thing about being confident about utilizing all the tools, but I think where we are in the journey, we are still in the nascent stage of actually exploiting at scale, right? We talk about DCO, we talk about contextual DCO and all of that. There's a lot of useful contextual signals. How do we embed that, all the way through the thinking process from this moment, the campaign briefs come out and, all the way to the execution. That's been the larger challenge. I think the tools have always been there. For the lack of a better term, I think we've been generally very lazy because of behavioral targeting. It kind of gives us the luxury to be lazy. But, I think that's the part that's evolving with the situation today. The fact that, all those crutches that we've had in the past has led us to this situation. It's a moment that we have to take advantage and go towards the right direction, adopt more of those technologies at scale. And Vince is right. It's easy to do it one-off, like for Coke. Weather is probably the biggest factor. It's hot. People buy a lot of Coke, so that's the biggest contextual signal that we go after. But there's much more to that than that simple execution, right? So doing it at scale, that's our biggest challenge in the upcoming months, if you may, right? So I think that's where a lot of the innovation needs to happen for us.
A technology perspective on that from both of you, actually. Let's start with you, Narayan.
Yeah, what Vid says is absolutely right? It happens in either as small as possible, right? In this room, if I ask a question that how many of you use an Android device, raise your hands. How many of you use an iPhone device? Now that's context. That's one level of context. How do I interact, or how do I take the brand messaging to the iOS person is different from how do I take it to an Android person, because of the innate nature of how the platforms work and what is available, what is not available, and data and IDFA and a lot of other these factors are playing a right role in it. But I'll come back to the most important aspect of it, that creative strategy or the creative process in the context of context is very, very important, because that can make or break your campaign. I mean, we had several examples. I don't even want to quote the names, but there is an aircraft accident news which is going on, and then your airline ad is next to it saying that how beautiful your airline is and how, it's a very, very wrong execution of contextual advertising. And that's when all these natural language processing or all the technologies what Vince is talking about are coming in handy to make sure that the context is in safe environment for the brand, and brands can easily execute at scale, and more technology gets involved in it. In our own example, right, in InMovie, we have a product called Glance, which is in India and Indonesia, wherein we have a lot of AI and ML, which we're talking about in terms of curating the content and creating the context. But there is enough and more human intervention right now, unfortunately or fortunately, because it was a very, very tight rope we walk on in the context of what content is getting served to the consumer, and then how the brand is interacting with that content. So it's very important. The creative process is probably the base in which the contextual strategy needs to be built. Everything else comes later.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things going on there. I suppose, Olga, I'm also interested in your point of view here from a software company. Do you work with any clients who you feel are more, I suppose, the word I want to use is seduced by contextual solutions because they feel as though the technology tools are enhancing the effectiveness of contextual advertising, or rather, are you in a position where you feel as though there's still a lot of challenges for brands to adopting contextual advertising?
I started thinking about seduced by digital advertising. It's very controversial.
Yes, I shall think of a better word.
Yeah, I think that there are still a lot of challenges in this domain, and global issues are being solved, privacy is being addressed. okay. Is it being addressed effectively? It's also questionable because we can see a lot of consequences that are affecting users and user behavior and user experience in web. But challenges that existed years ago and they exist right now, brand safety is tricky. You can go into appear with your very good and where you have tough investment into good creative. Eventually, if you interact with bad players, you might not even know and have control over where the ad would finally appear. If it's going to be compromised and the brand going to be compromised, or vice versa, publisher going to be compromised because publishers also need to be very protective in terms of what's being served to their pages. And it's good to see that solutions are becoming more and more sophisticated in terms of identifying fraud, identifying ways how this compromise is happening, but also we need to understand that ad tech has always been a good place for bad players. They are just catching up as fast as the domain developing. They are just being very creative in terms of how to play new rules. And I think that they are, in some cases, much faster because in that area, it's like less control over how new technologies are being adopted by publishers and by exchanges or big companies. Because there, you need to pass certain procedures before you implement and announce new technology, and then you plug it into integration partners. There, it's just very quickly. You could just insert a couple of tags, do JavaScript, and that's it.
So this is a good point. I was going to move on shortly to ask about things like industry standards and so forth, but let's before that go back to brand safety. So question for from an agency and a brand perspective, do you feel that those I think we could probably all agree they're fundamental challenges that face the industry. Do you feel that those are being addressed when it comes to contextual advertising? Vince, do you maybe feel, as you said earlier on, it's not an either or. These are issues that you've got to be considering across the board, and it's not, just discrete to contextual advertising. Are you having to approach it differently depending on what way you're executing the campaign? What's your point of view?
Yeah, I think the tools, nothing is perfect, right? The tools exist, but at the end of the day, it's only as good as the user, only as good as, the SLAs, the QA processes, the rigor and the consistency through which they're deployed, right? So, if you're an agency and, you have folks that, you can draw up all the process themselves, but they're not being, just very basic stuff like category exclusions, keyword exclusions, black-white lists. These things have been around forever, but it's always only been as good as the people deploying or, folks that are coding automated ways of doing that. But it still comes down to, can we get a consistent way of using this, and also getting folks to follow kind of standard operating procedure to actually, leverage the tools that exist.
And so then does that come back to strategic sort of positioning? Are we talking then about the strategic approach that said brand is adopting? Vid, what do you reckon?
Yeah, at the end of the day, from a brand safety perspective, I don't think there's any gap. I think Vince is right. It's about how we utilize it. Like when Cristiano Ronaldo did what he did, how quickly we react was the question, not really was there the right kind of tools to react to it. I think the reality is contextual is a lot more than that bucket of brand safety, and I feel this is something that advertisers and brands need to be really focused upon. That's one part of the equation, and I think it's well developed. I don't think it's a huge concern. Textual environments, video environments too. I think now moving into metaverse and all of that, I think we are getting the right kind of support and the right kind of innovations going on those fronts. What we are excited about is how about contextual beyond all of this, right? I think safety and suitability is awesome, but there is a degree of, hey, this particular guy is looking at a Barcelona website, how do we get the context that he's a, this particular sports team's fan, right? And how do we react to that kind of context?
Is this you, Vid? Are you profiling yourself here? Barcelona fan?
Possibly, right? I might change, if you ask me another day. But I think that's, really where I think is the missing link. Brand safety and suitability, we've seen enough adoption on multiple brand levels, yeah.
Yeah. Right, okay. So then from, I suppose, a technology point of view, how do we feel that technology tools and solutions are keeping pace with the demand? I suppose, we've talked about how there's a bit of a flight to context, partly inspired by a need to be focusing on privacy first, consumer choice and control. Do we feel that technology development in the industry is keeping pace with the demand for contextual advertising? Narayan, I'm going to start with you.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as the client and the agency both say, there is enough and more tools available. There is enough and more technology available, and the technology is obviously going at its own pace. And how much of that technology is accessible? I mean, we have a big client here who has enough deep pockets to afford one technology, and I'm sure Vince might get many requests with a smaller set of clients who might not afford. I mean, that's when I talk to my advertising partners that the way to do it is instance creation, wherein a large piece of technology can be instanced across multiple clients or a common usage kind of a program which we do it. But I think more not just from a client investment point of view, I believe that we should pull back and see that how do we solve a larger problem of brand safety from an industry standpoint, right? I mean, if there is a self-regulation on every other side, and as Olga rightly said, I mean, the most creative work happens how to cheat the system. And that's probably one of the best creative minds, and especially in ad tech industry, that every safeguard or safe railing you create, and there will be 5 other people to try and break it. So I think there is enough and more technology development happening, enough and more dollars getting pumped into each of the technology and platform owners here to make sure that it is protected, it is self-regulated, it is up to the standards of both consumer acceptance and the brand acceptance in that sense, because both are important. But I think it's all about how we as an industry come together and make sure that we all adhere to certain basic acceptable standards of self-regulation, and then go beyond it. And then it'll be much more simpler and easier, according to me.
Okay, so that brings me back a little bit, somewhat to data, and also, I suppose, a little bit of a tangent to industry standards. Vince, when we were chatting, prior to the event, you were talking about how perhaps the industry had been driven by this obsession with first-party data. Not that it's not important; we've all agreed that it's been the main subject of conversation today, but that maybe that has distracted from how they should be seeing the potential plurality in marketing solutions. So, how do you feel, I suppose, to brands and marketers that might be still, finding the concept of contextual advertising somewhat challenging? Maybe they're still really focused on performance advertising. What would you be saying to them to kind of get them to rethink that perspective?
Yeah, certainly. I think, it wraps up a lot of the, the questions we've, answered thus far in terms of taking into account, 2 things, right? The moments themselves, trying to capture, doing the back-end analysis to understand what are the moments in which the audience is most receptive to the advertising, but then also doing the research to understand kind of what environments your audience or the brand's audience is going to be resonating the most with, right? I think that's one thing. And then the other thing is, and this is a bit of a different answer than what you're asking, but I think in terms of what marketers should be asking for. There's a lot of, obviously marketers have a huge demand for first-party data, not just their own, but also the first-party data that comes from publishers, right? I think right now, kind of what's in the zeitgeist is publishers really making sure that they're capturing and monetizing their first-party data, because, there's more of a gap in the market now. But I would argue that, certainly like large publishers, premium publishers should be weaponizing their context just as much, if not more, than the first-party data. And the reason why I say that is because, if I were to, and this is, it's an N=1, but if I were to see an ad, a really well-placed ad that resonates with the property that it's on, there's a kind of a halo effect that happens. I can't quantify it, but I'll be like subconsciously, yeah, no, that makes sense, right? That's good placement. And there's the opposite thing where if I see like a pop-up ad and a brand appear, I'll be like, oh my God, what are you doing, right? It's probably, someone's not doing their job as far as like placement, et cetera. But in terms of what publishers can do, like they really should be looking into, finding ways of creating ad products beyond just segments around like content and contextual. There's various technologies we've talked about. There is meta contextual segments that are trying to capture, like, what if you had a segment that captures content that focuses on specific types of sentiment, or I think if there's like time of day type articles that come out during commute, or they're more snackable, can you create content around that? But those kind of things, as well as their own content APIs, there's lots of stuff you can do there. So I would say, marketers should be looking at those opportunities as well, in addition to everything else.
It's a really good point because obviously we're not sort of going very specifically deep into the publisher's perspective on this panel, but I'm interested in everyone's point of view on this. And Olga, you mentioned earlier on how important, for example, the brand safety piece is also for publishers as well, right? So what Vince's summary there was really quite powerful, the idea that publishers should be weaponizing their context. Do you at all work with clients that you feel are, from a publisher perspective, are really, focused on their contextual offering and feel as though it's a really good add-on to their monetization strategy?
Yeah, we have partners like that, and there is also like a larger structure on top of that in terms of contextual, because there are tools that are allowing to connect context with context by doing references to related context from other publishers. So it's like a lot of connections, as always in digital advertising, and everything is coupled. But what I wanted to bring, and this is related to what Vince mentioned, like if the ad is well placed, it is related to content, or alternatively, like you are reading something and the ad is very intrusive and breaking your user experience, right? For publishers, besides brand safety and everything, it's important that like we as a group and here at this conference are representative of all of the parts of the chain. Overall, like we need to work a little bit more on quality of what everyone is doing. We have enough tools. We have enough data. Everyone is sitting on pretty like large data sets, first party, historically collected somewhere. But we need to remember that there are other tools, for example, ad blockers. Or subscriptions-based, and we had a previous panel where it was mentioned that it is not common for people to pay for content, right? So, but there are certain publishers that are giving you access to full context after you pay the subscription. Or there are publishers that are giving you subscriptions which is ads-free, which is overall like setting in mind of users that either you enjoy the content of the pages and have nice user experience, and you pay for that, or we will be feeding you ads. And this is developing a negative attitude towards advertising as a whole action. And we need to keep that in mind. And I think that right now and I know I'm not answering like directly the question that you mentioned, but it's
getting close though.
Yeah, for all players right now, it is very important to think about quality and be a little bit more conscious of what we are doing and what tools we have to polish it a little bit more, to have clean environment, good attitude. And Adele mentioned that it's like trust was lost, and it is exactly what happened. And we need to restore that to be able to like get right user response, not to like I'm afraid to search something because I will be then bombarded with ads. Yeah. I would better avoid doing that. I will turn on the this hidden mode and will not share anything. That there are a lot of tricky things there.
So we've talked a bit about today that potentially the shortening of the advertising value chain, bringing the sell side and the buy side a bit closer together. Does anyone on the panel feel as though contextual advertising is enabling that to some extent?
I mean, yeah, I can start. And before I answer the question, can I just take a quick jab at the first party data
Please.
obsession?
Yes.
I think that's the right word you used. There's a massive obsession about first party data. But the problem there is everybody thinks first party data is collecting gold coins, but they're actually collecting bananas. It comes with a perishable date. Every data you collect is perishable unless until you enrich it, you contextualize it, you keep managing the data, and you keep using the data and reusing the data. And that's the significant problem in the first-party data collection I'm seeing right now. And to answer your second question, I think, yeah, absolutely. I think context has always been very, very close to the both supply side and the buy side, because if they won't work, and to take it back to the question on creative strategy, because the creative needs to work in the context of what the sell side and the buy side are coming together with that, right? And that, I think, is really helping both the parties to come together, work more closely than currently they're working right now. Yeah, it feels like we're going back in time, and again, because we used to do that, and I was talking to a friend of mine when saying we would call up a Yahoo or we'd call up an MSN and we'll place in that section, in that corner ad. And we have seen all of that, and the advertising has evolved from that stage. Probably we're going in a same direction again, which has worked for many, many years. But I think all in all, there is an absolute need for these both ecosystems to work together, both from a data point of view, sharing point of view, and creating that safe environment for both consumers and advertisers.
If I can jump, on the obsession around first-party data as well.
Well done, Vince. You coined the phrase for the day.
I never said it was a bad thing.
That's true. You did just say obsession. That was all.
Not a bad thing.
Oh, did I say that? Oh, okay. It's not. I'm not trying to demonize you guys.
Connecting to the previous session as well, it's a rat race, and at the end of the day, we have to think about the consumer's perspective, right? One of the common issues that I see in our industry, we love to look at it from our own perspectives, very rarely from a consumer's perspective. Do consumers really accept all cookies for, understanding what is the detail of it and, going through the motions there? Definitely not for me. I click on accept all cookies all the time because I just want to get rid of the pop-ups. Yeah. I think that's a damning statement, right? So I think contextual is not the default, but probably a necessary tool to consider a lot more heavily because of the privacy-conscious nature. But as an industry, we can't just keep reinventing the tracking wheel. We can't move from, I know we have this obsession with hashed IDs and trying to figure things out with smaller cohorts, but it's a rat race. Like Olga mentioned, there's somebody's going to figure out the actual profiles once you define a smaller number of cohort sizes, right? So that's why flock to topics, right? And, will topics be useful to advertisers? That's an existential question, right? So long story short, I think where we are headed to, contextual is a key, bridge, but there is innovation beyond all of this. Creative is a huge part of it, as Min said. I think that's a huge investment for us as a company as well. The potential beyond first party and the amount of resources that we put into first party collection needs to first be put on activation, right? It's a funny story that we always do. We have the collection numbers. We don't have the activation numbers at all. And it's a huge deal to try to understand how much is activated and in what time, right? And that's why innovation needs to happen on all of these other fronts, right? Whether it's contextual, creative, or even just mere activation of first-party data, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. We're just about running out of time, so I'm going to start with a final question to all of you. What is? I know this is, there won't be a silver bullet answer to this, but what's one thing that you want to see change with respect to contextual advertising in the coming 12 to 24 months? Olga, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. It's tricky because there are a lot of things. It's hard to define something one and only. But I think that I could summarize it and make it a little bit high level. I know we discussed standards and or rules that need to be followed, and it's strict in Europe. It's becoming strict in the US as well. I think that, and also there are more and more different alliances or groups are getting together to set up new standards, get together, bring something new to the market. I think that, and it is like a nature of human beings. Like for example, I will start drinking water, like 3 liters tomorrow. I'm very serious in terms of mindset. And tomorrow it comes and I like, okay, maybe 1 liter, maybe not. So then when it comes to implementation, it's long, it's the process with gaps, it is skipped. So I think what globally we could do as an industry is that, like, if there is an incentive and we plan to do something, introduce something, it should be first like a collaborative effort of all the players, not a surprise that is cutting someone from the industry, making monopoly more of a monopoly. And also, it should be consistent in terms of implementation further.
That's great. Vid?
I can go next. I think what I want to see is the simple foundations done at scale, right? Bringing contextual, signals very deeply embedded into the creative innovation space. I think that's really the big change for us. Cook has always been big on creatives. That's a huge asset. So the better we infuse, all of these signals at a creative level, I think that's going to be the biggest impact for us. I would love to say metaverse and all of that, but I think that's amazing. But at scale, this is going to be the foundation.
Let's start with the basics.
Yeah, I think kind of agree with Vid that whatever we can do to enable the context as quickly and as simplified in a process-wise available to the agency partners and the client partners, I think that's the big win. Right now, the immediate win, actually. I mean, we can keep on building blocks after blocks on top of that, but I think the immediate current instant win for us, the next step would be that making sure that the publisher ecosystem and the platform ecosystem would enable whatever context and the creative innovation available to the clients at scale. I think I'll agree with that.
Hard job. You go last, Vince.
Can I say 2 things, like really quick? It's not gonna be long.
You're allowed to say 2
okay.
things.
All right. So the first thing I think is just getting rid of the binary mindset of audience versus context, right? I think the first thing I said was very basic ways of leveraging audience data to inform, context, and so better kind of merging and thinking of these things as a continuum, and not as kind of like I'm either doing this or that. So that's one thing. And then second thing around standards, really, I think there is an IAB Tech Lab, content taxonomy, right? And those sort of things are used to have some sort of standardization across publishers in terms of what they expose to advertisers. And they're also putting that through seller-defined audiences, which is basically allows contextual segments to be passed through the open exchange. Adoption for seller-defined audiences is really low right now across all sides, and I'd like to see that increase, just so that there's more ways of transacting on context versus just a direct deal. I think that's always going to be important, but in terms of allowing publishers to weaponize their context at scale, it's good to have that option as well.
And the ancillary benefit of hopefully meeting some of the other ambitions on the panel as well, right? Thank you very much, guys. That was a fantastic discussion, loads of really interesting insight. Thank you for persisting with me and on my slightly sleepy afternoon mind, veering off in all sorts of directions. Round of applause for everyone. And now we're going to have a coffee break. Thanks, Vince, Narayan, Olga, and Vid.